Hi, everybody. I am just a minute early here, so I am going to give people just a few seconds to catch up. I hate, though, when there's a live broadcast and everyone's like, well, I'm just going to sit around here and wait for people to show up. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to wait for a minute, and then when 6 o'clock hits, we'll start on time. I will show those of you who were here early, look what I have on. It's my Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité t-shirt because I am always ready for a little French Revolution discussion. All right, it looks like there are a few people here. So as I'm doing this, if you have any questions, just type them in the side, and I'll try to kind of keep an eye on the chat and let you know what kind of, see if I can answer your question. If they're really off topic, I may also just tell you, I'm hoping I can come back and do 7 more of these videos and address each of the points. So, okay. It is 6 o'clock, so let's get started. So first, I want to just tell you a little bit about myself, just so that you know that I know what I'm talking about, because you should always evaluate the point of view and authenticity of your source, right? So I have a bachelor's degree from Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I actually was an IB student in high school, so and I teach both IB and AP. I majored in English and history at F&M, and then I have a master's in European history from the University of Michigan. Trying not to touch my face, but I have allergies, so that totally happens. I lived and traveled in Europe a ton, including a year that I spent living in Austria, teaching for the Fulbright Commission. I was teaching English there, just north of Vienna. I've been teaching in some way or another since 2000. I taught my first AP Euro in 2003. So I've probably been doing this about as long as most of you have been alive. I do also teach IB Euro. So if you have IB specific questions, you can always shoot me a message on my website, and I'll put the link in the comments. I also was a consultant for the Crash Course European History series. So you can see my name in the credits there, which was really exciting for me. They've been absolutely amazing to work with. And Bonnie Smith, who I don't know if you guys know, wrote, see, I have her textbook here somewhere. She wrote, or co-wrote at least, this textbook, The Making of the West. This is kind of an old edition, but I have a more recent one. She is brilliant, and I actually read one of her books in college, so was super excited to work with her. And then, of course, I think John Green is fantastic, so that was also great. So I know that we're all kind of freaking out because of the, because of the coronavirus, especially if you've already studied the Spanish flu, then you know how pandemics can go. Let's hope that our healthcare is a little better than it was in 1918. Interesting fact, the Spanish flu was only called the Spanish flu because Spain was so upfront about publishing information. Spain wasn't involved in World War I, and all of the belligerent countries were basically censoring information as it got out. So they seemed much worse, but really their cases were just as bad as everyone else. Probably actually started in Kansas, so it may be more appropriate to call it the influenza outbreak of 1918. I almost said 2018. No, that would be coronavirus 2019. I hope you guys are all staying healthy. I don't know what your schools are doing for any kind of distance learning. If anything, I think it's kind of a big problem, right? Because not all students have computers or internet access. Obviously, you guys have some sort of access or you wouldn't be here. But College Board said that they're considering different ways to do testing online. So I don't even know. Who knows what's going to happen at this point? So let's just be ready. We'll carry on with a little bit of normalcy. It'll be good for all of us. So just keep practicing your social distancing. I'll be here in my basement. You be there wherever you're at. And none of us can cough on each other. So I am going to follow up this video with, I'm hoping, at least 6 other videos on how to earn the points in the DBQ. I may combine a few of those. I'm trying to figure out a platform to do this on too, so that I can actually show the documents. I'm probably going to pre-record those so that I can show the documents. And if you want to download it ahead of time, I'm going to be using the 2016 DBQ, which is available in the AP College Board site. I know if you guys use AP Classroom, there's a lot of great resources there, plenty of practice questions. And I will post the link to the DBQ that I'll talk about in future videos in the comments as well. Today, I'm just going to kind of talk about an overview of the DBQ, how I think you should approach it, and how important the rubric is to really understanding how to score all of those points. I don't know how many of your teachers have been to the AP grading, but that was the first time I went, was a very eye-opening experience to me. I had always taught my students to teach this very holistic, like really solid essay, but it didn't always hit all of the points that they needed to get a 5 because they might miss one little piece. So at the grading, just to give you a little context, it's lately it's been in Kansas City in the convention center. We sit in this huge room. It's freezing cold. Everybody's like huddled up in their hoodies, and we just grade. We just read essays for days. For the DBQ, there's like a spreadsheet. We write down student numbers, and then we just check off points as the essay scores it. We're not allowed to write on the essay, so we're just like thesis, check. Outside information, check. So it's very much this kind of checklisty situation. Because we read so many essays, I think it can be helpful to try to really help your readers out, and to, for instance, you want to put your thesis in your introduction. Like technically a reader will give you a point for the thesis if it's in the conclusion, but they may miss it, right? They're reading hundreds and hundreds of essays at a time. So that's just an example of something that you can do to make sure that all of the points that you write actually get scored. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm getting some sort of spam call and I don't know how to stop this. And there it goes. Sorry about that. I'm going to have to figure that out too. So this is a little bit formulaic, but that's okay. At some point, you're going to take off the training wheels, and eventually you're going to have this really solid foundation for being able to analyze text, being able to construct an argument from various sources. So to do that, I think in order to get the 5, if that's your goal, know the rubric. Know it backwards and forward. Use it. It will be in kind of rough form at the beginning of the DBQ, but you don't want to refer back to that. This is the biggest time crunch on the AP exam. You don't have that much time to write this DBQ, and it's hard. Like even when I sit down and write it, it's hard for me. And I have a master's in European history. So like I have all the context available to me, and it's still hard to just crank out a solid 7 essay in the limited time. So know it off the top of your head. Don't have to look at the description on the actual DBQ once you get into exam day. One of the most valuable things I think you can do is to look at some of the student samples that are on the College Board, and then actually grade that DBQ against a DBQ rubric. So decide whether or not it got the thesis point. Decide whether, keep track of how many documents they used. So I think I'll post a link to that in the description as well. And then you can look at the DBQ that I'm going to be talking about. You could practice writing it, which would be probably the most helpful thing you could do. And then you could look at the student samples and then go through the checklist process, grade them, and see how or if they scored all of the 7 points. And on the AP website, they have, I think, everything from a 1 to a 7 most of the time, because those are the essays that they use to get all of the graders on the same page. So they'll give you, a packet with all of these essays in it, and the graders will all sit down and mark them and say, okay, I think this is a 7. And somebody else says, no, I think it was a 6 because da, da, da. And then the College Board will explain their reasoning to us so that we're all on the same page. I think they do a really good job norming all of the graders so that we're all giving points for the right things. So what are the 7 points? Just out of curiosity in the comments real quick, how many of you think that you could name all 7 points off the top of your head? Boom, 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 boom. I'm going to give you 2 seconds to think about that. Could you name them? Dead silence, crickets. Nope, nope, nope. Okay, so by this time in the year, this should be automatic. So I'm going to list them in the comments, but I'm going to go over them one by one here. This is the order I think you should do them in first, too, because I think that it leads to a solid essay and will help you get the complexity point. So there's 7 points on the DBQ. Keep that in mind. There's 7 things you have to memorize, like just to keep in your head, I need to do these 7 things. And actually, when you write your DBQ, have a checklist nearby and make sure that you check off that you've done all of these things. Some of them kind of automatically. Others, I think you have to just remember to throw in, like the outside information is a little bit artificial. So the first point and the thing that I would suggest you start your essay with is context. Context is just setting the stage, right? So for example, if the DBQ were about the Reformation, you could talk about other things that were happening in Europe around the time of the Reformation. So Martin Luther nails the 95 Theses to the door, the church in Wittenberg, on October 31st, 1517. I always tell my students 15, not 16, 17, to help them remember that date, because dates can really help you out too. That's where you can get some points for specificity and just kind of make your essay a little stronger. So for context for the Reformation, you might talk about exploration. Like everyone learned the phrase in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You could talk about that. You could talk about the opening of the New World and how that was leading to all of this change, and how when Martin Luther set off this Reformation, it's also going to have an impact on the Americas, right? Because a lot of the reason that people were exploring the Americas was for God. The Jesuits were in the Americas trying to convert natives to Christianity, specifically to Catholicism most of the time. So that's how you can get the context point. And again, I'll try to go into more depth on that point in a separate video. The next thing that you're going to do is write your thesis. So your thesis has to be two things. You need to have an argument, and you need to explain your reasoning for your argument. So basically you have to look at the question, take a stand, and explain why you think that's the way that it is. That's the part that people often miss. I think the biggest thing you can do to make sure you get that thesis point, the easiest thing anyway, is to use the word because. So if the question is to, let me think of a question here, to consider, I'm trying to think of a recent DBQ, whether or not whether or not Bismarck was a new conservative, you would have to look at the idea of conservatism, right? And then you would have to either agree, yes, he was a new kind of conservative, or no, he wasn't. Or sometimes a really good thesis can kind of do both. He was in this way, but not in this way, because, and then explain your reasoning. I usually do the thesis in one sentence, sorry. And then in the next sentence, I'll summarize, well, what arguments am I going to use to support that claim? So that's basically a summary of what your body paragraphs are going to be about. Now that they don't have as many documents, they used to have, gosh, I forget, 15 documents or 14 documents on the DBQ, and they've really restricted that down now, right? You only have 7. So I used to have my students do 3 documents in every body paragraph, and that usually did the trick. But now you don't even have that many. So I still kind of shoot for around 3 body paragraphs, but maybe one of your body paragraphs, you're using your outside information to support your argument. Maybe you only have 2. It doesn't really matter as long as you make sure you use sufficient documents. So that's the thesis. The next thing that you have to do, so that's 2 points so far. The third point is to describe 3 documents. Now the key here is don't quote. Nobody has time for that. You're cranking this essay out super fast. Your reader knows the documents better than you. They've just read 100 some essays about this very topic, and they've been referring back and forth to the documents all the time. It's very rare to quote in history anyway. The only time you might quote a document is if you're talking about like the tone or the word choice or something, which is somehow related to your analysis of the document. So maybe you had a document on the I Have a Dream speech, right? Martin Luther's I Have a Dream. Like, that's a beautiful speech. Maybe there you would talk about how just quote some of his language because he's so poetic, right? And then you could talk about word choice and use that in your analysis. But generally, you're just going to summarize what the document says, or whatever part of the document you're trying to pull out to prove your argument. And then I think this is really key. Put in parentheses Doc 1 or Doc 5 or whichever number it is, because as I said, these graders are reading hundreds and hundreds of essays. You just want that to be easy for them to find. They can just go through and read your parenthetical citations and say, oh, they've used 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 docs. Great. Make their job easy. The next one is to make sure that you use that you describe your 3 documents. I'm sorry, I was just reading your questions here and then I got distracted. I don't know Ms. Cooper. I don't know who that is. I just posted this link on Twitter and on a Schoology page and whatever. I do use HIPPO with my students. I actually tend to use HIPP because the O part of that is a separate point. So HIPPO does a great job for you with a little bit of a little asterisk there to kind of explain some more. So as talked about describing your 3 documents, you also want to use those 6 documents to support your argument. You can't just summarize what they say. Now, the good thing is to get that first point, it's easier. You do just have to summarize what they say. So you could write a really crappy essay, and as long as it had context, thesis, and described 3 documents, that's 3 out of 7. It's probably not going to get you a 5, but it'll move you along the way depending on how you do on the rest of your essay. If you use 5 documents to support an argument, you can write a fantastic essay and get no point for that point. And this we see a lot at the AP grading. You'll have students who used, 5 documents really well, but they're not going to score that point, and therefore that's going to bump their essay down a little bit. Or they'll use, 2 points of view and not hit the other one and therefore not get that point. So it's really important that you keep track. And I actually suggest that when you write an essay, as you kind of in that reading time, have some time to plan out your essay, which is absolutely vital. Figure out what your body paragraphs are going to be. And then maybe you list like 1, 4, and 7 under body paragraph 1, 2, 6, and 5 under the other one, or so on. And then just cross them off as you use them so that you know when you've used them, and you don't have time to duplicate either. So that really can help to organize you. The other thing that I do when I'm using those or summarizing those documents is I keep track of which ones I'm going to do. Like if I'm going to do point of view or something, I just write POV above Doc 2. So that and then I cross that off as I go as well. So you use your 6 docs to support an argument. I'll probably do one video about both of those things because using and describing the docs is kind of similar. But the key being that you can't just summarize what the document says. You have to do the next part. So if any of you have done like a CER paragraph in science, claim, evidence, reasoning, you're making a claim. That's your topic sentence, right? Your document is your evidence, and your reasoning is, why does the document prove what I'm claiming, right? How does the document prove your point? How was Bismarck a new conservative? How did he carry on some of the traditions from previous kinds of conservatism? So you have to do that reasoning still, right? It's explaining your thinking. And for some reason, students are really reluctant to do this, but this is where you kind of have to have some confidence, and also where you can be a little bit creative. Say, it makes sense that this person would say this because, and then you kind of give sort of a scenario, like you really have a chance to explain your thinking here, and don't be afraid to do that. Now, don't ramble on forever. You don't have time for that. You want your writing to be kind of tight, but that gives you the chance to really show off what you know. Okay, the next point is what I call HIPP, or your teachers might call HIPPO. I tend to separate the two because HIPP is how you get one of the 7 points, and outside information is a separate point. I try to do them early because I know I'm going to be frantic and panicking at the end because you don't have that much time. So if I'm doing my body paragraph, my first body paragraph is documents 1, 3, and 7. I might do point of view on document 1 and purpose on document 7. So those of you who don't use HIPP, this is how you can get these points. So explain the historical context of a document. What was happening around the time that this document was written? If you recognize anything about kind of the scenario around that, maybe it's Galileo's letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, you can talk about the context of the scientific revolution and the religious conflict and all of that. Intended audience, who was this written to? Why does that matter? Like, how does that impact what people say? And just to give you an example, say you go to school on, well, a regular Monday, not a coronavirus Monday. Say you go to school on a regular Monday and you haven't done any of your homework. Are you going to go up to your teacher and you're going to say, oh, sorry, I didn't do any of my homework because I was too busy playing Xbox all night long? Of course not, because your teacher's going to be like, 0, and that's it, right? So you come up with this elaborate story about how something with your dog eating your homework or technical issues or whatever, like, your audience impacts what you say. Now, if you're texting your BFF about why you didn't get your homework done on Monday, you're like, oh yeah, I was playing Xbox all night, or I was on Snapchat until 3 in the morning. Then you're going to be honest. So that audience impacts how we view a document, right? And you have to think of that anytime you read anything. If you're watching the news, what do they have? What are they trying to convince you of? What's the ideological leaning of this news station? What is their ultimate goal? Like probably to make money, right? Television news could do 24 hours of in-depth reporting, but instead they do the same kind of 10 minutes of really surface reporting 24 hours over and over and over in a row. So think about their purpose just for existing. You can always think too about like who, maybe you'll recognize the name of who they're writing it to, or who, a picture was intended for. You can always ask yourself, was this staged? Is this picture real? Or was this some sort of propaganda? Like, especially if you're getting into the 20th century and you're looking at the dictators, like certainly could be propaganda. Every time I get a picture of Stalin in the Crash Course videos, I'm like, are you sure, Stan? Is this real? Like, do we know this wasn't staged? And about half the time they are staged. Either they're staged, or in some cases, you've like visually erased Trotsky from a picture, which you could do. All those Photoshop terms came from like actual techniques that they did in photo editing. Okay, a couple of questions here. Do we have to use all 7 documents? I think it's a good idea. You only have to use 6 though. So that point about supporting the document, supporting your arguments with your documents, you only have to use 6 of them. However, you have to use them to support an argument, right? So if there's one that you're a little shaky on, and that's often the case, throw it in there, cite it, but try to use it to support your argument, but you may not hit it. I always think it's a good idea though, just to kind of cover your bases. Can historical context be used when we do context for our first paragraph? Yes, but here's the key. You cannot double dip. So if you use historical context up in your first paragraph, which you absolutely should do, check, point for historical context. It does not count for HIPPO on one of the documents that you use. So this analysis point, this HIPP point, I suggest students try to do 4. So, and to me, POV is kind of the easiest thing to teach, but context and purpose and audience often come up as well. So just kind of thinking about why this document exists is what that point is, whatever you want to call it. Shoot for doing 4, because this is the thing that students mess up the most. They think they've done a real solid POV and not really. Like they haven't quite hit the threshold. And the deal on POV is you have to think about who this person is impacts what they say. So go back to the situation of you didn't do your homework. A student is most likely going to tell their teacher that they didn't do their homework for some legitimate reason because they're trying to get a good grade. That would probably score you POV if your source were about some student not doing their homework. So that's your historical context we talked about. That's kind of setting the stage. But here's the key. In both, if you're going to use historical context twice, if you're going to use it for a document, just make sure you've also done it in your intro. But for both of these, you have to use some specificity. So you can't just say, there was a war going on and it was hard. And we read a lot of those. No, that doesn't cut it. Give me something. How was war hard? Like, okay, maybe it's something about, you're reading something about the post-war era and your document is something about how soldiers suffered. So you give some context for that. Okay, well, how did soldiers suffer in World War I? Well, the trenches, they were stuck there for months and months, and they had trench foot, and there were a lot of rats, and the mud was really bad. Like, give some specifics about how that was bad. Maybe you even mentioned the Battle of the Somme in 1916. Names, dates, events, all of those things can help score that point because it gives it some specificity for historical context. Intended audience, I already talked about. Point of view, in some ways, this is the easiest because in that little description under the documents, and I would read that before you read any of the documents. It'll tell you Edwin Chatwin, what was his title? I think he was used. Edwin Chatwin was in the 19th century. He traveled around England and he was talking about how horrible the working conditions were in factories. So you could just talk about how he's writing this report to the government about the working conditions in factories. Oftentimes they'll have that information in the document. It's not enough to just repeat what it says in the source information, but you can explain how that impacts what the person said. So the sentence stem that I teach my students is, it makes sense, whoever the author is, would write this because, and then you explain why it makes sense. So for instance, if they talk about a political party, it makes sense a socialist would support improvements in factory conditions for workers because socialists believe, their support came from the working class, and they believed in restructuring politics to give workers a voice. That should be enough to score you the POV. Now, outside information, just use this somewhere in one of your body paragraphs. Again, I try to do it in the first 2 body paragraphs, even though that might make my paragraphs a little uneven. I just want to get it out of the way and make sure I get it done. So outside information, use specificity, names, dates, events. It can be something from another history class. It could be something that you saw on the History Channel. It can be something you watched on Crash Course, or I don't know if you guys know the series Extra History, but it's really funny kind of animated series about history. Whatever, as long as it was not in the documents, you should be good to go, as long as you use some specificity and as long as you're using that outside information to support your argument again, right? So explain the fact and then explain how it proves your point. Usually it's something that kind of supplements the documents. And then the last point is the hardest one. This is what I think of as the unicorn point, right? Like you really have to write a sparkly unicorn of an essay to get the complexity point. There's a couple of different ways you can do it, though. The biggest thing is to get the documents in conversation with each other. If you understand how these documents connect, sorry, I'm just knocking things off willy-nilly. If you understand how these documents connect, that can really help you get them in conversation with each other. So maybe you look at how a socialist reacts to an event and how a communist reacts to an event and how a conservative reacts to an event, and you recognize that that they're going to have different points of view on that. Somebody asked, when you use outside information, do you have to cite your source? Nope. You can't make anything up. And readers won't have access to the internet when they're reading, but they will have access to textbooks, and they know a lot of history. So you can't make anything up. I have definitely seen that. But you have to just have the specificity in there and use it to support your argument, but no citation necessary. All right, I think I'm going to kind of end it here. We're almost up to 30 minutes, which is a little bit longer than I intended to go. But do you guys have any last minute questions or anything that you want me to cover in future videos about specific topics? Complexity. Okay, so synthesis used to be a separate point on the DBQ, and they dropped that, I think, 2 years ago. So you don't have to do synthesis. That can help you get the complexity point. So I think of it this way. The documents you're writing a DBQ, right? And you're making an argument. So you want to have, like, your thesis is like the trunk, and the roots are like your analysis. And then the branches are your body paragraphs, and the leaves is the evidence, the documents that you use, right? The synthesis is stepping back and seeing the whole forest. How does this relate to the bigger picture? How does this relate to something in another time or another place? That's how you could use synthesis, but I don't want to go too much into that because it's not a separate point on the essay anymore, just to say that it's a way that you can get the complexity point. I think that using all the documents can help you get the complexity point. I think that getting all the other six points on the DBQ can help you get the complexity point. I'm going to list the 7 points in the description. So let me just go over them real quick again. So it's context, thesis, describe 3 documents, use 6 documents, do HIPP on 3 documents, so shoot for 4, and then outside information is the 6th point, use it to support an argument, and complexity is the 7th. And I'll list them in the description below so you can check that over again if you missed that. So let's see. It looks like some of you are answering questions for me. That's great. I clarified all 7. I am going to save this so you can watch it again later if you want. And be sure to subscribe so that you can see my later essays or my later videos. I'm going to actually try to like pull a DBQ off the College Board website that you guys can refer to as I'm talking about it, and just kind of talk through how I would go about writing a DBQ and how you could score all 7 points on that essay. All right. If you guys don't have any more questions, I'm going to end there. Stay safe, everybody. Don't assume that just because you're young and healthy, the coronavirus won't affect you. I assume that you all know old people in your life who you don't want to get sick, and it is hitting young people hard too. So just keep your distance, right? 6 feet. Okay, guys, have a good night.